There are boxers who fight for glory. There are boxers who fight for money. And then there is James "Lights Out" Toney, one of the most naturally gifted fighters to ever lace up gloves, but also one of the most brutally honest, sharp-tongued, and fearlessly outspoken men in boxing history. James Toney didn't just box people, he embarrassed them, he taunted them, he bullied them, and if he didn't like you, the whole world knew it. Across 3 decades, 3 weight classes, and over 90 professional fights, James Toney built a reputation as the ultimate throwback fighter. Slick defense, inside fighting mastery, and some of the meanest trash talk the sport has ever seen. Today, we dive deep into the rivalries, interviews, personal grudges, and real-life moments behind the 6 fighters James Toney hated the most, based entirely on reality, public statements, press conferences, and behind-the-scenes reports. Get ready for a journey full of explosive press conference moments, legendary insults, fights that turned into personal wars, and grudges that lasted for decades. This is the truth behind James Toney's most hated opponents.
6. Iran Barkley. Coming in at number 6 is a rivalry that most boxing fans have never heard about, but insiders swear it was real. Iran the Blade Barkley, the Bronx brawler who allegedly turned Toney's own training camp into a war zone. Here's what supposedly went down behind closed doors. Barkley and Toney were sparring partners in the late 80s, grinding it out in Detroit's toughest gyms. But according to sources close to the situation, these weren't friendly tune-up sessions. They were bloody battles that had trainers scrambling to separate them.
This is a job for a rookie. You should pull this guy up and say, "You're not later on." That's right, those body punches.
Barkley, already a seasoned professional with knockout power, allegedly took liberties with the younger Toney during sparring, targeting his body with vicious shots that crossed the line between preparation and punishment. The breaking point supposedly came during a particularly heated session when Barkley allegedly told Toney he was too slick for his own good, and that his defensive style was pretty boy boxing. Toney, never one to back down from verbal warfare, reportedly fired back that Barkley was a one-dimensional puncher who'd never outbox anyone with real skill. What made this feud particularly bitter was the professional jealousy element. Barkley was struggling to maintain his status as a middleweight contender, while Toney was already being hailed as the next big thing. Training camp sources claim Toney would purposely embarrass Barkley during sparring sessions, making him look foolish with his slick defensive movement. The animosity allegedly lasted years, with both fighters taking subtle shots at each other in interviews whenever the other's name came up. 5. Evander Holyfield. Coming in at number 5 is a rivalry that boxing politics kept from ever reaching its full potential. Evander "the Real Deal" Holyfield, the cruiserweight king who allegedly dismissed Toney as nothing more than a blown-up middleweight with delusions of heavyweight grandeur. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Throughout the mid-90s, Toney was desperately trying to establish himself as a legitimate heavyweight contender, while Holyfield was already the division's established champion. But according to sources close to both camps, Holyfield never took Toney seriously as a heavyweight threat. The disrespect allegedly started during a chance encounter at a Las Vegas casino, where Holyfield reportedly told Toney he was too small to hang with the big boys and should stick to fighting middleweights. Toney, never one to tolerate being dismissed, allegedly fired back that Holyfield was an overrated bum who got lucky against old men like Foreman, and that he'd knock his holy head clean off his shoulders. The verbal warfare escalated when Holyfield's trainer allegedly leaked to the press that they considered Toney a novelty act rather than a serious contender. What made this feud particularly frustrating was the missed opportunity element. Toney genuinely believed he could expose Holyfield's vulnerabilities, especially after watching him struggle against lesser competition. Training camp insiders claim Toney would study Holyfield's fights obsessively, pointing out flaws and weaknesses to anyone who'd listen. The animosity allegedly intensified when promotional politics and weight class politics prevented their clash from ever materializing, leaving both fighters with lingering resentment that lasted well into their retirement years.
Number 4. Bernard Hopkins. The rivalry that never happened and still created hate.
When it comes to fighters James Toney genuinely disliked without ever stepping into the ring with them, Bernard Hopkins is at the top of the list. Their beef was public, heated, long-lasting, and rooted in something simple. They both believed they were the greatest middleweight of their era. Why the hate started? Back in the 1990s, when both men were reigning champions in the middleweight division, their names were constantly compared. Journalists asked, who is the real king of 160 pounds? Who would win, Toney or Hopkins? James Toney didn't like comparisons. Hopkins didn't like disrespect. And the spark turned into a flame. The first public shots. Toney began taking digs at Hopkins in early interviews. Bernard Hopkins fights scared. He holds, he headbutts, he fouls. He wouldn't last with me. Hopkins fired back. James Toney doesn't have discipline. He's lazy. He's unprofessional. These weren't small insults. They were personal attacks on character. Why they never fought? There were 3 reasons. 2 different promoters, financial disagreements, and Hopkins wanted catch weights Toney refused. But Toney always claimed he didn't want it. He knew I'd beat him up. Hopkins responded, Toney talks because talking is easier than training. The 2000s, the hate gets louder. When Hopkins unified the middleweight division and beat Oscar de la Hoya, Toney was furious at the praise Hops received. He said, Hopkins got famous fighting small guys moving up. He never fought a real dog like me. Hopkins, being the master of psychological warfare, calmly countered, James Toney eats himself out of divisions. I stay disciplined. This insult became legendary, and James Toney never forgave it. Toney's anger in interviews. Throughout the 2000s, Toney would randomly bring up Hopkins in interviews even when nobody asked. Bernard fights dirty. He headbutts people to death. He ain't real. I would have destroyed him at 160 or 168. And he meant every word. Hopkins responded, I'm still winning titles at 50. Toney can't win a diet plan. That line went viral, and Toney exploded. He told reporters, I'll fight Hopkins anywhere, anytime. Winner takes the whole purse. He won't do it. The fight still never materialized. Behind-the-scenes reality. Promoters from both sides have admitted, Toney wanted the fight at cruiserweight, Hopkins wanted it at light heavyweight. Neither man would bend. The talk kept increasing. A gym insider once revealed, Toney brought up Hopkins more than any fighter he never fought. Legacy of the rivalry. Both men became Hall of Famers. Both dominated their divisions. Both moved up in weight. Both defied expectations. And both never settled the score. James Toney believed he would have beaten Bernard Hopkins. Bernard Hopkins believed Toney lacked the discipline to survive 12 rounds with him. No punches were ever thrown, but the hatred was real, the talk was real, and the rivalry remains one of boxing's greatest what-ifs.
Number 3, Roy Jones Jr. When people talk about James Toney's rivalries, there is one name that stands above all others, Roy Jones Jr. Their hatred didn't start in the ring. It didn't start at the weigh-in. It started long before, in the early 90s when both men were rising stars and the media constantly compared them. Early tension. Toney always believed he was the better boxer. He thought Roy got special treatment, easier fights, and too much hype. In interview after interview, Toney said, Roy Jones didn't want to fight me when I was at my best. Roy fired back, James Toney talks too much because he eats too much. And that lit the fuse. The 1994 super fight. When they finally fought, James Toney came in drained, overtrained, and struggling to make weight. Roy Jones dominated, but Toney never accepted that loss. After the fight, the hatred only grew. Toney told reporters, Roy Jones fought a dead man that night. Fight me at cruiserweight and I'll retire him. Roy refused. Years of insults. Throughout the early 2000s, Toney attacked Roy in interview after interview. He's a coward. He cherry-picks opponents. He's scared to fight real fighters. He runs from challenges. Roy responded calmly but sharply. James needs to stop talking and lose weight. Why Toney hated him? 1. Roy beat him in their biggest fight. 2. Roy never agreed to a rematch. 3. Media always ranked Roy higher. 4. Tony felt disrespected every time Roy downplayed him. Behind the scenes, trainers who worked with both men said Tony would bring Roy up unprovoked even years later, shaking his head with anger. Freddie Roach once said, "James never got over that fight. That was personal for him." The truth is, Roy Jones Jr. is the one boxer James Toney hated for decades, maybe for life.
2. Mike McCallum. Coming in at number 2 is the rivalry that nearly destroyed both men's careers before it even began. Mike, the body snatcher McCallum, the Jamaican assassin whose alleged betrayal during contract negotiations turned their anticipated super fight into a bitter feud that consumed the entire middleweight division. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Throughout the early 90s, both fighters were being positioned as the premier middleweights of their era, with boxing insiders salivating over a potential unification bout. But according to sources close to both camps, McCallum's team allegedly used inside information from joint promotional meetings to sabotage Tony's negotiating position, deliberately leaking details about Tony's demands to the media to make him look greedy and difficult. The breaking point supposedly came during a heated phone call between the fighters, when McCallum allegedly told Tony he was nothing but a loudmouth American who didn't deserve to share the ring with real champions. Tony, never one to tolerate international disrespect, reportedly fired back that McCallum was a boring foreign fighter who put crowds to sleep, and that he'd send him back to Jamaica in a body bag. What made this feud particularly venomous was the cultural and stylistic clash. McCallum represented old-school Caribbean boxing discipline, while Tony embodied American swagger and natural talent. Training camp sources claim both fighters would study each other's fights obsessively, with McCallum allegedly telling sparring partners that Tony's defense had holes big enough to drive a truck through, and Tony reportedly calling McCallum's style predictable and prehistoric. The animosity allegedly reached its peak when promotional politics prevented their clash from ever materializing, with both sides blaming the other for the super fight that boxing fans never got to witness, leaving a permanent stain on both their legacies. Number 1. Michael Nunn. Number 1 is the most personal and devastating rivalry of Tony's entire career. Michael second to none, the former sparring partner whose alleged betrayal turned their friendship into a blood feud that ended with one of boxing's most brutal knockouts. Here's what supposedly went down behind the scenes. Back in the late 80s, Nunn and Tony were inseparable training partners, grinding it out in Detroit's grittiest gyms under the same trainers. But according to sources close to both fighters, everything changed when Nunn allegedly promised to help Tony get his first major title shot, only to secretly negotiate his own deal behind Tony's back, cutting his former friend completely out of the picture. The breaking point supposedly came when Tony discovered Nunn had been feeding information about his training habits and weaknesses to opposing camps. During a confrontational phone call, Nunn allegedly told Tony he was too dumb to handle business, and that he'd always be second-rate compared to real champions. Tony, feeling completely betrayed by someone he considered a brother, reportedly fired back that Nunn was a backstabbing snake who'd pay for his betrayal in blood. What made this feud particularly devastating was the personal element. These weren't just professional rivals, they were former friends who knew each other's secrets, weaknesses, and fears. Training camp sources claim Tony became obsessed with getting revenge, allegedly telling anyone who'd listened that Nunn had sold his soul for a title shot, and that he'd make him pay for every lie he told. When they finally met in the ring in 1991, Tony's vicious 11th round knockout wasn't just a victory. It was personal vengeance served cold, ending their friendship forever with one devastating left hook.
James "Lights Out" Toney is a boxing legend, the defensive genius, a natural talent, and one of the last true old-school fighters. But behind the skill was a man fueled by emotion, grudges, and raw intensity. He didn't just fight with his fists, he fought with his heart, his pride, and most of all, his hate for anyone he believed disrespected him. Roy Jones Jr. Evander Holyfield, Iran Barkley, Bernard Hopkins, Michael McCallum, Michael Nunn. These weren't just opponents. They were chapters in the story of one of boxing's most controversial, outspoken, and beloved warriors. This was the truth behind the top 6 boxers James Toney hated the most.